Hi guys, it's Whiskey Emerson here, and I am back this week for episode 3 of Legacy, the Artist Behind the Legends. And for this episode of season 2, we are covering the life of Mary Wollstonecraft. And she was one of the most remarkable women I've ever studied at university and after as well. So I'm really excited to cover her this week. For all my lit nerds out there, you guys are going to love this. Ooh, look at my hair. I got a loose one. We'll adjust that. Anyway. I'm so excited for this week. I hope everybody has their French 75 ready to go. And let's get the party started, shall we? Also, I'm going to apologize in case there's any trundling in the background. My dog has kind of been needy today, so if you hear doggy footsteps, that's who it is. Anyway, let's do this. Mary Wollstonecraft was one of the most revolutionary and influential feminist thinkers of the Romantic era at the end of the 18th century. As a writer and philosopher, Mary is perhaps best known for her work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, a piece that argues that the presumed inferiority of women to men is due to their lack of an equal education. However, Wollstonecraft's genius stems far beyond this progressive and, for the time period, radical article. Not only did Mary fiercely advocate for female rights in her very short 4 decades of life, but she also was actively involved in the French Revolution and was additionally present when the revolution went to hell and became the Reign of Terror. No shit. Wollstonecraft's literary works, regrettably, spent over a century following her death being ignored and condemned by the intellectual community for her unconventional ideas and due to her own lifestyle, which, while nowadays we might see as rather ordinary, the Victorian and tight-collared 19th century folk definitively disagreed. But to a certain degree, you can probably understand why, given the context. She had 2 children, 1 out of wedlock, suffered and survived 2 suicide attempts, was seen as an active traitor to Britain for her participation in the French Revolution, and let's not forget the horrendous demand for gender equality. Can you imagine? Mary Wollstonecraft is, by and large, a woman to be admired, one who loved openly and without stigma, a woman who worked her ass off to support herself, her sisters, and her friends through literary publications. And last but not least, she set the groundwork for the future feminist philosophers that would follow in her wake. So let's go ahead and get this episode rolling, shall we? I'm Whiskey Emerson, and you're listening to Legacy. Hi all, and happy Friday. It's Whiskey Emerson here, and I'm so pumped to be with you guys this week covering the life of Mary Wollstonecraft for episode 3 of season 2 of Legacy, the Artist Behind the Legends. I'm going to work through homework fast this week, mainly because this episode is going to be much, much bigger than I anticipated. I started out thinking that this was going to be a shorter 30 to 35 minute episode, and now I'm thinking it'll be definitely in the 45-minute range, perhaps a bit longer. So just fasten your seatbelts. You are on this roller coaster ride with me, all right? So, hugely busy week. I had a great time at my signing at the Barnes & Noble in Beaverton, which is just outside of Portland. Thank you to everyone that came by. I know there was a handful of people that came in and saw me and bought a book, and it was great to see you guys and have people come out and just come out and support the arts. So, thank you so much. I spent a lot of this week working on East of Hell, which I am proud to say is coming along quite nicely, and hopefully will be done by the end of the summer. Fingers crossed. It's been raining pollen in Portland. My poor friends that have allergies have just been dying, and thankfully I'm one of those people, knock on wood, who has not had that issue, but you never know. I mean, literally, it looks like there's snowflakes coming out of the sky. That's how bad it is right now. But anyway, like I said, we're going to go through this fast. If you love Legacy, if you love me, if you want to support a creative project, I have a Patreon page for the podcast. It is www.patreon.com/legacypodcast. If you want to become a member, you get all sorts of fun perks. I'm working on stickers for the Patreons that have already signed up right now, and you also get things like my show notes, the drink of the week cocktail demonstration, which I do in a video for you. And I basically just want to build a foundation here so we can have more fun stuff, merch, maybe a live event. I would love to do a live event at some point if I can get this podcast big enough. Just collaborations, even all sorts of fun stuff. So if you guys want to support me, want to support the podcast, it can only make this better and more fun for all of us. So please do that. If you want more info about me, you know where to find me, www.whiskyemerson.com. And the Legacy Podcast website, of course, is www.legacywithwhiskey.com. Hell yeah, let's get going with Mary Wollstonecraft. I promise I'm going to stop slamming things against the table now. So, let's do this, guys. Our drink of the week is a French 75. Ooh, yeah. Mine is already made. And for the demonstration that I just did for all my Patreon supporters, love you guys, one of the things I addressed here is that during the end of the Romantic era, at the end of the 18th century, you have gin being a huge, huge fucking deal. You have champagne being a huge deal. And also, you have the French Revolution. So I thought, let's add those three things together. And we have a great summer cocktail, which is kind of getting there. We had a couple of days and now we're backtracking, but whatever. Anyway, so the ingredients are 1.5 ounces of gin, 3/4 of an ounce of lemon juice, 1/2 ounce of simple syrup, and of course, champagne. So the instructions are super basic. Just shake all the ingredients in a shaker, lots of ice, minus the champagne, unless you literally want it to explode all over you. Been there, done that too many times. Once you're done with that, just basically strain it into a flute and top with champagne and garnish with a lemon twist. And if you're kind of tacky like me and drinking it out of a wine glass, do that. I break every freaking glass that we have in this house. I'm just one of those people. I break everything. It's terrible, whether I'm washing it, whether it's in the dishwasher, or whether I've had too much to drink and I just start throwing my hands around. I break everything. So anyway, cheers, you guys. I hope you enjoy this cocktail. It's one of my all-time favorites. And let's get started with Mary Wollstonecraft. Best known works: A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Yeah, that's pretty much her best known work. She's written a lot of other pro-feminine pieces, mainly stemming around education, a couple just around, fallen woman, and basically almost in a weird way, it's hard to say because she doesn't really make them like the stereotypical rule books that really came about for women in the 19th century. There's a huge rise in what they would call the conduct novels to teach girls what not to do. They weren't really that so much as they were just stories of fallen women and basically what that had done to their lives. So A Vindication is definitely her best known one, and let's just dive right into her life. So Mary was born on April 27th of 1759 in Spitalfields, London. Wow, butchered that. Great start. To parents Elizabeth Dixon and Edward John Wollstonecraft. She was the second of 7 siblings, the eldest daughter of the family, and during her early childhood years, the family lived pretty comfortably on solid financial grounds. However, this would take a turn when Wollstonecraft's father began to squander family money on his attempts at becoming a gentleman farmer, which literally just means what people would consider a more higher class farmer during the day. Now, this happened on multiple occasions, thus causing the family to move frequently, and the situation was so dire that at a certain point, Edward made Mary turn over money she would have inherited from family at maturity to him to pay off their debts. What a bastard. Sorry. Anyway, you'll quickly learn here, as I did, that Edward Wollstonecraft was a huge prick. And you'll see that, it's pretty obvious when you hear about his antics, how just kind of the feminist groundwork was laid into Mary's mind at a very young age. Her father was violent and he was a lazy piece of shit. He spent most of his money on either alcohol or on speculative projects rather than on his family's well-being. He would often beat up his wife in a drunken rage, and Mary, devoutly loving her mother Elizabeth, would lie outside the door of her mother's bedroom to protect her from Edward. I mean, and this is, in her prepubescent life, she's dealing with this type of thing, and you really start to understand where those maternal instincts kicked in early and started to develop. And she would also go on to support both of her sisters, Everina and Eliza, throughout her life. Now, two friendships from Mary's youth would prove to have a deep and lasting impact on her future. So first was her friendship with a young girl named Jane Arden. Jane and Mary, when they were, 13, 14, was when their friendship really formed. They would basically just read books together and would attend lectures locally put on by Jane's father, who was kind of a philosopher and scientist in a town called Beverly. He's kind of like a pseudo-intellectual. I know it sounds negative, but he was a pseudo-intellectual. He thought a lot of himself, but this was the first introduction for Mary, basically getting exposed to a highly intellectual atmosphere, particularly at the Ardens' household, where they would often host parties of, just academically minded and liberal friends of theirs. Hold on, I'm going to grab a sip of my French 75 here. Oh. The second friend, and probably the most important friendship of Mary's life, was with a young woman named Fanny Blood. The two girls were introduced through a couple named the Clares, the Clares were like a surrogate, they were surrogate parents for Mary in her adolescence, and they lived really close by. Wollstonecraft's home life was extremely unhappy, and so she took solace in spending time with the Clares and with the Blood family whenever she could. In 1778, Mary desperately wanted an escape from her family, and so she left home to accept a job as a lady's companion to a widow in Bath named Sarah Dawson. A lot of young women would do this. You'd have these older ladies that really were kind of seeking friendship and just seeking someone to travel with, kind of just to keep an eye on them and make sure nothing happened to them. And if it did, obviously they would have someone there to just, get help or just to take care of them. So, unfortunately, her time with Dawson was unpleasant, to say the least. And in 1780, upon hearing that her mother was ill, Wollstonecraft returned home to care for her mother, Elizabeth. She got the hell out of there. And as far as I can gather from letters and just from a couple of the historical biographies I read and skimmed through this week, I think this Sarah Dawson widow that she worked for really was kind of the first introduction to high society life for her. And she started to realize how the women of high society were just not her cup of tea. So for a time, Fanny and Mary, obviously were still very close, and they envisioned a future together, just the two of them, living in kind of a female utopia where they would be able to rent rooms together and actually support each other emotionally and financially. And I know what you're thinking. My mind went there too, because, and I couldn't find anywhere basically stating that these two were romantically connected or involved, even in the slightest. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. Either way, I think they were just best friends, wanting to fight the normal societal structures they didn't want to abide by. I mean, if you basically were growing up knowing that your entire life would be dependent on a man, I know that's what they're programmed to think during this time period, but wouldn't you find some rebels in there that would want to do something different? I know I would. So there were a few hiccups with the women of Wollstonecraft's life. First up is Mary's sister, Eliza. And Eliza was hit with a serious bout of postpartum depression following the birth of her first child and the repercussions of a bad marriage. She was married to a man who was relatively abusive and would drink quite a bit, very similar to her own father. Mary convinced Eliza to leave both her husband and her newborn child, which not sure I'm cool with that, but she did convince her to do that. And Eliza followed suit, and Wollstonecraft basically set up all the arrangements to assist her sister in fleeing. While it was thought to be a good idea at the time by both of them, it had severe consequences for Eliza. She suffered social condemnation and could not remarry, which subjected her to a life of poverty and hard work. So, while I can understand Mary's thinking, she's young, she's very feminist driven, and this is a way for her to prove that to herself and to her family and her friends. It also really negatively affects her sister in the worst possible of ways. So, in an effort to change the system, Wollstonecraft, Fanny Blood, and Mary's sisters set up a school together in the progressive dissenting community of Newington Green. And the dissenters were a group of people just committed to combining reason with piety, and who looked forward to a more just and egalitarian future. So very much forming into the ideals and morals that Mary would abide by in her later years. Now, around 1785, we have this second hiccup that really throws Mary off course. So Fanny ended up becoming engaged and then married to a man named Hugh Skeys, S-K-E-Y-S. I have no idea. And sadly, Fanny's health was starting to deteriorate. She was a victim of consumption, or as we all know, tuberculosis, which was the disease that killed so many of these wonderful artists back in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. The couple moved to Lisbon, Portugal, for the better climate for Fanny, who in time did become pregnant. This unfortunately caused her health to just collapse even further. And Wollstonecraft was forced to close the school that she and Fanny Blood and her sisters had opened around 1786, and she hastily traveled to Lisbon to take care of Fanny. Her efforts, unfortunately, again, were in vain. Fanny and the newborn child died, and Wollstonecraft's world just completely shattered. Mary was devastated by Fanny Blood's death, and in order to help her, some of her friends assisted in securing her a position as a governess to the Kingsborough family in Ireland. Her time in Ireland was both good and bad. Good in her relation and education of the Kingsborough daughters, who adored her. One of the daughters actually later in life wrote a couple of letters to, I believe, William Godwin, talking about how big of an impact Mary Wollstonecraft had on her and how it completely changed her life, which is so incredible. Now, the negative aspect is Mary's relationship with Lady Kingsborough, who disliked Mary from the moment she walked across the threshold, which you'll find out why in just a second. Hold on. Sorry, that was my Van Gogh, what the hell do you call these things? I don't even remember. The thing that doesn't let me get a ring on my desk. Anyway, so Ireland was frustrating for Wollstonecraft. It became further inspiration for her to address the limited career options open to respectable yet poor women. And to Mary, Lady Kingsborough was the epitome of what was wrong in women. Their coquetry, their weakness, their manipulating of power, their dependence on men for their identity. In later recollections, Wollstonecraft is adamant that this was one of the final stages in developing her feminist philosophy. So between The Widow, I think, and Lady Kingsborough, Mary Wollstonecraft really starts to feel like she has a very disheartened view of society women and this upper class life, and she starts to realize that is a huge part of the problem altogether. Deciding that the role of governess was by no means for her, Fanny made a monumental and extremely risky choice. She left Ireland and embarked on a path to try and make herself into a writer. Very few women during this time period could support themselves by writing, zero. There were very, very few. None that I can name off the top of my head other than her, which, yeah. And Mary basically described in a letter to her sister, Everina, as wanting to become, and I love this, the first of a new genus. I love that. Doesn't give a shit that she's the first one. She's going to do it anyway. It's awesome. Wollstonecraft moved to London and found work with the liberal publisher, Joseph Johnson, who aided in finding her a place to live. Mary would later describe Johnson in her personal letters kind of just as a father and a brother to her. They were super, super close. And after teaching herself French and German, Mary did a series of translations and additionally wrote reviews, primarily of novels, for the magazine run by Joseph Johnson called The Analytical Review. She was a consistent contributor and just always was producing articles, was reading through books. I mean, this was a time of growth for Mary. She was constantly writing and reading more than ever before. And on top of that, her intellectual acquaintances just snowballed in their numbers. She would attend dinners at Joseph Johnson's home, famous during the Romantic era, might I add, and hung around with people like the radical pamphleteer Thomas Paine and philosopher William Godwin. More on him later. But anyway, hold on. I keep getting a tickle in my throat. I'm sorry, guys. I think it's because, like I mentioned earlier, there's so much goddamn pollen in the air right now. Whew. So while Mary lived in London, she got caught up in a relationship with the artist Henry Fuseli, who was then a married man, though unhappily married. She realized she was in love with Fuseli and proposed that he and his wife could come to a platonic living arrangement and allow the two of them to be together. This was not received well, and Fuseli broke off their relationship as a result of this. So, a little embarrassed, wanting to get the hell out of London, Mary packed her things and went to France to participate in the early and far more optimistic days of the Revolution. She had put herself on the map with her piece Vindication of the Rights of Men, which was published in 1790. And this was as a response to Edmund Burke, who was a Whig. I just love that they used to call that Conservative Party Whigs. It just makes me happy. I don't know why. And it was published in 1790, like I said. And Edmund Burke wrote a pretty monumental critique of the Revolution as a whole, siding with the monarchy, obviously. And Mary Wollstonecraft then was compared to big names in the day, such as Joseph Priestley and Thomas Paine, who she used to hang out with. Overnight, Mary became famous in both England and in France for her article and stance on the Revolution. So you have not only the fact that she is a woman, but she is writing a hugely popular political piece. There were so many people in England and in France that stood behind this revolution at the time. And it's an incredible opportunity for her, and she seizes it, and it absolutely goes her way. I do want to note here, before we kind of get further into the French Revolution stuff, Mary was not on the side of the radical Jacobins, I don't know. She was on the moderate Girondins side of the revolution, so you can probably guess how things eventually turn out for her. But a little quick background on the French Revolution. Basically, you had the abolition of the French monarchy, which was King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and both of them were guillotined. Oof. You have the initial establishment of a secular and democratic republic that changes its tune real fast into a militaristic, authoritarian regime. So basically, the Jacobins decide that they want to kill everyone, thanks to Robespierre, who is a dick. Then comes Napoleon Bonaparte and the war with other countries. So that's that in a nutshell. Sorry, I'm not going to elaborate on that more, but it would take me forever to get into the details of this revolution. It was very complicated. So again, before we get into her France years, I do also want to add that just before she left, A Vindication of the Rights of Women was published in 1792. And the first publication was anonymous. So the one that originally was published was not published under her name. And the second, which was published after she was already in France, gave her credit where credit was due. And the combination of both of these vindication pieces put Mary on the top of her game. You know, she arrived in France originally and people knew of her, people respected her, but when Vindication of the Rights of Women then was added to her repertoire, oh my gosh, I mean, everyone knew who she was. And she really, as a philosopher and as a feminist during the time, I mean, she put herself on the map. So in the vindication of the rights of women. Mary argues that educational reform is necessary to give women access to the same educational opportunities as men. Otherwise, educational systems would deliberately be training women to be frivolous and incapable. So think what we talked about earlier, like everything relies on flirting and manipulating men and getting married and being a dumbass. And I don't mean to actually be a dumbass, but you couldn't be smarter than the man you were with, or that would, obviously be a blow to his ego. It's something that is still put into women's minds today, mind you, but we'll get around to that. Mary abhors the idea that females be seen strictly as arm candy or as the sexual object or the barefoot mother in the kitchen. And she really wants to portray women as capable of working in any and every profession that a man can hold, including parliament. Hell yeah. So now that you have an understanding of what vindication was, France quickly became a complete and utter disaster for Mary for a multitude of reasons. She arrived in 1792, right after both vindications were out and, heightening fame. And this is a little over a month before Louis XVI had his head chopped off, when France and Britain were on the brink of war. She had numerous friends urging her not to go, but Mary went and joined a group of expatriates living in Paris, and initially she actually really loved it. I think it was a very dynamic group of like-minded people who were similarly wanting this type of a revolution in Great Britain. In March of 1793, shit gets real. The Jacobin-run Committee of Public Safety takes over in France, thus ensuing a totalitarian regime, and Wollstonecraft's petition to leave France for Switzerland was denied, and it wasn't just tough for Mary. All foreigners living in France were put under police surveillance, had to have at least 6 written statements from French men testifying to their loyalty to the new republic, not a republic, and by April, all foreigners were forbidden from leaving France. All of them. Mary watched as some of her friends were imprisoned, and others even lost their heads. It was bad, and it was really fucked up. Here's an actual cough for you. So, right in the middle of the turmoil, oh, hold on guys, sorry. Goddamn pollen. So right in the middle of the turmoil, Wollstonecraft fell in love with a man named Gilbert Imlay, an American adventurer, and sadly, like so many of us ladies tend to do, Mary kind of fell in love with the potential of the man, the idea we always have that they're like this, but they're not quite there yet, but they could be one day. Yeah, we all make that mistake, and unfortunately, Mary was head over heels for this guy and made that mistake and could not let it go, poor thing. But anyway, to protect Mary under such treacherous of circumstances, Imlay actually did a cool thing here. He registered her as his wife in 1793, despite them being unmarried, and he and Mary were never arrested during the Reign of Terror due to Imlay assisting in blockade running and chartering ships to bring in food and silk from America to France. And this was due to the blockage Britain's Royal Navy put up, causing, all sorts of shortages and worsening the inflation in France. And if you're wondering, why is America helping France with this? Well, it's actually because the French had just helped us win our revolution in the United States against Great Britain, and so we owed them a favor. So, by filing a false statement to the United States Embassy in Paris that he had married Mary Wollstonecraft, Imlay essentially made Mary a U.S. citizen, and this protected her from arrest in the Reign of Terror. And this is all in a world where every day there were arrests and public executions of the enemies of the Republic. Basically, anyone who disagreed with Robespierre. Dude was such an ass. So this is a direct quote from one of the letters that Mary wrote to her sister Everina in March of 1794. It is impossible for you to have any idea of the impression the sad scenes I have been witness to have left on my mind. Death and misery, in every shape of terror, haunts this devoted country. I certainly am glad that I came to France, because I never could have had else a just opinion of the most extraordinary event that has ever been recorded. Woo. So, in May of 1794, Mary, pregnant, gave birth to Imlay's child, and she gave birth to a daughter named Fanny. She obviously named her daughter after her late friend, Fanny Blood. Things did start to dramatically unravel with Imlay basically from this point forward. He was not the domestic type. I mean, he's an adventurer. He works for the U.S. government. He loves being on the road. Dude is not sticking around, if you know what I mean. So with the fall of the Jacobins later that year, so later in 1794, a pattern of lengthy absences of Imlay made Mary suspicious he'd obviously found someone else in London. He was making all sorts of trips all over, but London was his primary destination. And that entire winter of 1794 to 95, which was one of the coldest winters on record at that point, the entire Seine froze over. He was gone the whole winter. And so, obviously, Mary was a little hesitant to return to London because the British government was cracking down on all sympathizers of the revolution. And Wollstonecraft feared she might not be exempt from being tried for treason, and I have to agree with her there. I would have been terrified. So in April of 1795, however, she could stand life no longer without Imlay, and she went to London to find him with her daughter. But upon arrival, Imlay rejected her, and not a month later, Wollstonecraft attempted suicide. It's said that she most likely used laudanum, but no exact method is given, though somehow Imlay managed to save her just in time. So Mary attempted to win Imlay back and set out on a journey with her daughter, Fanny, and maid through Scandinavia, writing an extensive travelogue. Oh, sorry guys, hold on. I've got a dog whining and it's just ridiculous. Oh, I think she's trundling away. All right, she trundled away. So, like I was saying, she wrote an extensive travelogue and history of the area, and when she reached home, it was at last clear that there was no saving her relationship with Imlay. For a second time, Wollstonecraft attempted suicide by throwing herself into the Thames, but she was saved by a stranger, random person on the road who just happened to see her jump. Ugh. Now, initially in her letters and in her journaling, she was a bit resentful. However, I think once she had a second chance, she really wanted to start all over again. And Mary was taken in by her previous literary crew in London and under Joseph Johnson's wing. And this was the beginning of Mary's passionate love affair with William Godwin. So the two of them had kind of an odd courtship. They quickly became fast friends when previously, when they'd been associated, they hadn't really gotten along very well. And this blossomed into just a passionate love affair. The two of them fell madly in love with each other, and a few months into their relationship, Mary discovered she was pregnant. So while Godwin was a staunch advocate against marriage, the pair wanted their child to be legitimate, and so they chose to marry anyhow. Now, there's a lot of kind of bullshit around this. A lot of scholars say that, like, Mary made him marry her, but that's not the case at all. It was really just to make sure their child was legitimate. They wanted their daughter or son to have a chance in the world, and the only way was to basically not have a child born out of wedlock. So, because they chose to marry, this news basically brought about the reality that Mary had not been married to Imlay ever, and that her first child, Fanny, was born out of wedlock. And as a result, Godwin and Mary lost friends that didn't want anything to do with them because that was strictly forbidden. So on August 30th of 1797, Mary gave birth to her second daughter, Mary. As you all probably know, this was Mary Shelley, or Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, previously a recorded episode of Legacy, the Artist Behind the Legends. And she's also the author of Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, literally a Gothic masterpiece of the 19th century and one of my favorite books of all time. Followed right behind in her mother's footsteps, and I love it. So unfortunately, the delivery of Mary appeared to go well at first, but the placenta broke apart during labor and became infected, causing puerperal fever. And this was a very, very common occurrence in the late 18th century and would prove to be fatal in certain cases. So after several days, Wollstonecraft died of septicemia. She had 10 days of high fevers, agony, just constant body pains. It was awful. Godwin was absolutely distraught over the loss. And this is in a letter he wrote to a friend. He said, quote, "I firmly believe there does not exist her equal in the world. I know from experience we were formed to make each other happy. I have not the least expectation that I can now ever know happiness again." End quote. Whew. It's so terrible. Such a short time together, and she's taken that quickly right after giving birth. It's just awful. To make everything much, much worse, Godwin published a tribute to his wife the following year, releasing edited publications of Mary's works and personal letters of hers that she just kind of kept throughout her life. He wanted to do this to celebrate her, and it backfired on him. Godwin believed he was portraying his wife in a beautiful and sincere manner, yet instead the public were now aware of Mary's illegitimate child, her love affairs, and of her suicide attempts, and she was blacklisted until the early 20th century by scholars. Completely blacklisted. So, conclusion here. Holy shit, that was like 3 women in one, for one. I really think there is so much that can be said about Mary Wollstonecraft, and obviously I won't get to touch on every aspect of that today, but it is evident that Mary spent much of her life assessing and wrestling with the complexities of women during her day, and many of those intricacies she recognized in herself. Wollstonecraft was on the front lines for equality, first against a monarchy and then against sexism, advocating for equality of both genders and living and breathing her own philosophy regardless of how that philosophy might foil her own ambitions. Her life is a direct reflection of the duality of women, our want of independence and of our converse need for love and attention, our fears of motherhood but our concurrent yearning for it, our sexual desires and drive for romance that, if we aren't careful, cloud the logic and intelligent decision-making when it comes to relationships, or to be honest, just life in general. In spite of all that, Wollstonecraft did hold true to her ideas, and her drive to further her education and career kept her afloat when it seemed the culture of her time was failing her. With less than 40 years on this earth, I'd say that's one hell of an accomplishment. So, cheers to you, Mary. You fucking earned it. So, Whiskey's recommendations. Obviously, I'm going to recommend Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Not all of it. Honestly, even just the first couple chapters are brilliant. So well done. It's not very long. Very, very short in terms of, like, I think it's under 60 pages, but it's brilliant for the time period. It's revolutionary. Highly, highly recommend the read. If you haven't read it already, I know it's required reading at university if you're an English or a lit nerd like me. So, also, I'm pretty impressed, guys. I was a little nervous that this was going to be a long one, but I just kind of punched right through that there. So, let's talk about episode 4 of season 2 next week. We are heading to the dark and dreary 19th century Russia to cover the life of novelist, short story writer, essayist, philosopher, and journalist Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky reflects mainly upon human psychology, philosophy, and religion in his works, and these themes all hit close to home during a very turbulent time in Russia's history, although, to be fair, that's pretty much just Russia. So, anyway. Many critics claim that Dostoevsky is the greatest psychologist in the world of literature, and if you need a quick refresher, he's the author of Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, or Notes from Underground, and this is considered to be the first existentialist novella ever written. This guy lived one hell of a life, from being published at 25 to being imprisoned and exiled, gambling addiction, and of course, like I just mentioned, he's believed to be one of the greatest minds of his generation. So tune in next week to hear all about this Russian legend. I'm so excited. I've been putting off this episode for a while, and I'm pumped to finally do this. I am one of those rare souls that has read all of Crime and Punishment. And to be honest, I didn't hate it. I didn't. I thought it was fascinating. So that'll be next week for episode 4. I hope you guys enjoyed Mary Wollstonecraft. I had a blast covering her this week. So many flashes back to like women's lit in college. Like I wish I could show you all the women in literature books I have sitting on my desk right now that I just went back in, and it was just like doing a refresher. I absolutely loved it. So I hope you guys learned a little something about her life. Maybe if you're female, you feel a little more empowered, I mean, people have been fighting this fight for over 2 centuries. And it's brilliant to see something, especially like the Me Too movement right now, where all of a sudden a voice is given to women and to men who've never had it before. And it's just opening the door and opening a platform for so many wonderful people who have never been able to articulate their stories before. So, I just love it. I just love it. So anyway, I hope everybody has a great weekend. Also, if you love the podcast, please leave me a review on iTunes. Reviews help me so much. We're up to double digits. I know that. So if you can help me out, go leave me a review. Tell me if you love the podcast. Tell me if you love it. You can always email me. You can find my email on the website. But anyway, like I said, happy Friday. Have a great weekend. Get outside and enjoy that great spring weather. And I'll see you next week. Cheers. Hey guys. Always is interesting taking this off. I hope you guys enjoyed Mary Wollstonecraft. I had so much fun putting this week together. I really did. I've always loved her stuff, and I find her to be just such a fascinating and resilient character of history. So anyway, have a great weekend. Enjoy your French 75. I'm almost through mine, as you can probably imagine. But anyway, thanks for being here with me. I'll see you next week. We'll go back to Mother Russia with Dostoevsky. All right? Cheers.